About this college, Francis, I have moved from another institution and I joined this college. This college is near Coimbatore, you know. It's a tier 2 city in Tamil Nadu, and it is a
Okay.
industrial hub. And Pollachi is nearby Coimbatore, and it is surrounded full of mountains and lush green. And maybe you just travel 20, 23 kilometers, that is 15 miles for you. You can see elephants and tigers. And I know you would not a great fan to see tigers here. So it's a
No, I think I could do without that.
so it's a beautiful place, and I think I have completed 4 to 5 months here, and people are very good. And this is in a very much rural setup, and people are so kind and generous. And the college is so good, and they are treating me well.
Good, good.
Okay,
And you
Francis,
deserve
I
that.
think it.
You deserve that.
Oh, I deserve that. I know you're always kind.
Well, shall we get
Okay,
started?
Francis, I think. Yeah, we should. In fact, I should allow the organizers to take over the forum now. And folks, please, you can start the program by a formal introduction or whatever you want to do.
Right, sir. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our online Augmented Lecture Series 1, Arthur Miller's Death of Salesman. I would like to invite Dr. R. Vanilla Nancy Christiana, Associate Professor, PG and Research Department of English, STC, to give our welcome address for this session.
Good evening, all. I welcome you all to the Augmented Lecture Series 1, and I welcome the resource person of the first lecture series, Mr. Francis Heid. I welcome our Honorable Vice Principal of Academic Affairs, Dr. Selvin sir, for helping us to experience such kind of innovative forum. I welcome you, sir. And I also welcome all the participants from various institutions, students from our college, and all the faculty members of STC. Welcome one and all. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I would request Dr. V. Selvin, Vice Principal Academics and Head PG and Research Department of STC, to introduce our resource person.
Yeah, thank you. So now my job is to introduce Francis Heid Jr. To the 77 participants in the Zoom today, and we have some participants in the YouTube channel also. Francis, you're going live in YouTube too. I'll share the link later. Looks like you're becoming a celebrity here in India. Okay.
I try.
Yeah. So I'll introduce my friend, Mr. Francis Heid. Francis Heid and we met out of a very strict and a hard bargaining, negotiating deal. And it was a crucial deal for HCL Technologies, and it was a transforming deal for Advanced Earth Communications, where Francis was heading the operations. And at first, I was a little nervous, and in fact, I was not very new to the US geography. Not only the geography, and he taught me a lot of history. That's a very good thing. He's a history buff, and moreover, later I found he was a great literary guy. He used to discuss a lot of books, and you know what, team? I was made to read literature when I was in corporate by Mr. Francis Heid. So that was, in fact, I should be sort of thankful to Francis, because in corporate life, no one reads literature and discuss. No one discusses Kafka, or no one discusses any other literary figures. Even Charles Dickens, for that matter, we used to discuss A Tale of Two Cities, and a lot of Thomas Hardy, and a lot of such. At one time, we used to discuss Boccaccio. So my corporate journey was a little made easy when compared to the stressful meetings and travel and everything, Francis was my literary companion through my corporate journey for at least 8 years, Francis, correct? Yeah, 8 long years. And when I was in US, and we always discussed literature outside of the corporate meetings, and I was so astonished to find Francis Heid's wife, Jocelyn. She also has graduated. She has a master's in literature, and it was literature everywhere. That's number one. And number two, we have turned academicians here. Most of us are academicians. I would say Francis has realized literature. In fact, I would rate Francis's criticisms, feedback to a point where I would rate it much higher than any academic writing, because his is really a real reader response, not an academic response like the way we have to write an essay to score some marks or assignments to go score some grades. His is real literary passion. That's number two. Number three, his depth in understanding literature combined with life, that makes a marvelous personality. Number four, today's topic, he has taken Arthur Miller's The Death of Salesman, Death of a Salesman. In fact, he has acted in one of the, I think as one of characters, should be, it is...
it was Biff.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so I think, so we have a full personality here who has seen much life. He has traveled to India, and we have traveled lots of places. And we have, then he has wide collection of books you see in his background. I think this is only one part of his collections. And he has read most of them. And he's a very erudite person. And we are honored to have a person like Francis Heid among this crowd. And he loves crowd. And I would invite all the people in this meeting to raise as many as questions possible. And Francis Heid would be definitely answering all those questions. I invite Mr. Francis Heid to the forum. Now, Francis, the forum is all yours.
Thank you very much, Sullivan. I'm sure I do not deserve the praise that you just gave me, but I do appreciate it. I will tell you that, yes, I did indeed act in 2 Arthur Miller plays. As a matter of fact, I was one of John Proctor's children in The Crucible, and then I was Biff Loman in Death of a Salesman in high school. Our high school was very good at drama. I like to say that I'm a Renaissance man, as Selvin says. I was deeply involved in business. I never really quite fit in business because I was interested in the arts, and I never quite fit in the arts because I was in business. And so I like to call myself a Renaissance man. In 8th grade, I was named the best history student of my class. In 12th grade, I was named the best math student in my class. And in graduating college, I was named the best English student in my class. So I like to think I'm a Renaissance man. I did, after I went to 2 colleges, St. John's University here in Minnesota, and then I went to the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, North Dakota, where I literally became best friends with many of my professors. I then went on to Columbia, where I did 2 master's theses, one on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and another on Nathaniel West's Day of the Locust. My wife and I were running out of money, and so one of us, Jocelyn, was close to getting her PhD in philosophy, and we decided that she should keep going, but eventually we had a kid, and so we neither one of us finished our academic careers, but we went on to be fairly successful in business. And so that's sort of my background. I think Selvin will tell you that he said earlier, I get excited, I get really involved in what I do. And so I will try to talk slowly, but I do tend to get carried away. So today, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Arthur Miller's biography. Then we'll go on and we'll do a performance history of Death of a Salesman. We'll talk about Arthur Miller's influences, what helped him to write Death of a Salesman. We're going to spend some time on a controversial issue. When Death of a Salesman came out, there was a big argument about whether this was a tragedy. So we're going to spend some time talking about the definition of tragedy. And then we'll go into some interpretations of the play. I'll use the characters to draw conclusions about what's going on in the play in terms of what it's about, what matters about it. And then, feel free, ask questions in the course of the lecture, but we'll also reserve some time at the end for more questions. Actually, Arthur Miller would be 108 years old a week from today. He was born on October 17th, 1915. He died on February 10th, 2005. He was the second of 3 children of a family of immigrants. His father was a Jewish immigrant who came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. His mother had been born in New York City, but she also came from Eastern Europe from a Jewish background. The father owned a women's manufacturing business, a women's clothing manufacturing business, and was really quite well-to-do. He employed 400 people. He had a chauffeur. He had a summer home. They lived in Manhattan on 112th Street, a block away from where I lived when I went to Columbia. And so they were really quite well-to-do until, as happened in many people, the stock market crash in 1929. He basically lost everything. His family ended up moving to Brooklyn, and then Miller himself, Arthur Miller, now was old enough that he could take jobs himself. He did okay in high school. He was a good athlete, an okay student, not a great student, but he decided that he wanted to go to the University of Michigan. And at first, they wouldn't accept him because his grades weren't good enough. But he wrote a letter to the dean of the university and basically begged and said, I will quit college if you don't think I'm doing any good by the end of the first year. So he comes to college. He works jobs on the side. As a matter of fact, he works in the Navy Yard. He majors in journalism in University of Michigan and does in fact finish his degree. He wins cash awards. He writes plays at the University of Michigan and wins awards for them. And so his life is looking good. He's showing a lot of promise. But after college, it's World War II, and so works in the Navy Yard while writing radio plays. He does get a military service exemption from World War II because of a football injury he got in high school. And he now writes his first play. It's the Man Who Had All the Luck. It won another award, but as often happens on Broadway, the play flopped. After 4 performances, it closed, and so it was a disaster. But in 1947, his life turns. He writes a second play called All My Sons. So 1947, just a couple years after the war has ended, and this is a play, in fact, about a post-war topic. What happens is all of the boys are coming home from the war, and they come home to find that there were some people who stayed in the States who made a lot of money off of the war. And so there's a lot of resentment, a lot of discussion about this. Was it fair that the boys had to go off to war and yet people stayed back and made a lot of money? And that's what this play is about. The father of the main character made a lot of money in the war, manufactured engines for aircraft. And at one point, he manufactures some cracked cylinder heads that go on the planes, and he sends them out on the planes anyway. The planes crash, multiple people die, but it turns out the father manages to hide his involvement in it and blame his partner. His oldest son finds out that the father knew about the cracked heads and commits suicide by crashing an airplane. The youngest son comes home at the beginning of the play and really doesn't know what has happened. And in the play, it's revealed, the story goes through and we see what happens. It was a major success. Actually, I recently read another play that was from the same time that had a similar subject. So this was obviously a topic that was very hot at the point. And so he basically becomes now a major success. This is one of the biggest plays in Broadway at the time. He wins a Tony Award for Best Author, and now his life turns. He is a success. His next play is going to be Death of a Salesman. He tells a story about how he came to write the play. He met his uncle in the lobby of the theater that was showing All My Sons. The uncle basically he's a salesman, and he ignores all social rules, and he starts talking not about the success of Arthur Miller's play, but about his son's success. The first thing he says is, my son Buddy, Miller's cousin, is doing very well. Miller thinks to himself that the uncle probably still thinks that there's some kind of competition between the cousin and Arthur Miller. And obviously the father thinks Arthur is a loser, and there must be some competition, and he's a loser. But Miller becomes obsessed with what his thoughts were, what his uncle's thoughts were about this competition. And in fact, a few years later, the uncle actually commits suicide. So that's the background, that now he has this, he's thinking about this, and now he takes the money that he gets from All My Sons and he builds a studio in his backyard. And the first thing he does, once the studio, he builds it himself, like Willie, he builds it himself. And the first thing that he does is he starts writing a play to be called Death of a Salesman. He literally writes the first act of the play, one of the most significant plays of the 20th century. He literally writes it, the first act, in one day. And he finishes the play over the next 6 weeks. So in basically 6 weeks, he creates one of the key quintessential works of the 20th century. And when he releases Death of a Salesman, he now becomes a major political voice. He becomes a celebrity, and obviously he's a playwright. He is involved. We're going to talk a little bit about the theater group that he was involved in. He was good friends with Elia Kazan, who directed Death of a Salesman. But as we'll see later, Elia Kazan became involved in the McCarthy hearings, the hearings of the House for Un-American Activities, where they investigated communists in the government and the arts and condemned them. But Miller continues his run of successful plays. He writes his next play is The Crucible, which is a play about the Salem witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts. He draws these invisible parallels to the House for Un-American Activities of what's going on there. And he starts off the play. It really doesn't do very well in the first run. He blames the director, and a year later he comes back. He remounts the play on Broadway, and it becomes another major success with all this parallel to the McCarthy hearings. But now, because he wrote about this invisible parallel to the McCarthy hearings, they are now attracted to him. And so they call him before the House of Un-American Activities. He had been promised that he would not have to name names. That was a big deal. Name names. Will you tell us who were communists that you knew so we can start to turn on them? And he's promised that he doesn't have to do it. But once he gets in front of the committee, they begin to ask questions, and he refuses to answer. And that was a major intellectual discussion of the time about, did you cooperate with the McCarthy hearings or did you not? And if you cooperated with the McCarthy hearings, you were able to survive. If you didn't, you were blacklisted, and many careers were completely lost. Arthur was blacklisted, but he fought back. He was charged with contempt of Congress, and he took it to court. And the court, now, if you know anything about the McCarthy hearings, they gradually lost popularity, and people began to question what they were doing. And so he wins in court, and they have to overturn his conviction. And he his sentence is reversed, and so it's a major success for him. So also at about this time, he meets the famous actress Marilyn Monroe. He divorces his wife, and he ends up marrying Marilyn, and they become closely involved. Monroe really wanted the relationship to work. She converted to Judaism to try to make the relationship work. But as time goes on, she becomes more and more involved in drugs. Miller writes a screenplay for a film called The Misfits with Clark Gable and Marilyn Monroe in it. And during that time, she just completely loses it, goes back into drugs, and they separate and are divorced. And then a year later, Miller meets another woman named Inga Marath, who was a photographer, and they remained married until she died in 2002. Controversially, also after this experience with Marilyn Monroe, he writes another play called After the Fall, which I really happen to like. But critics at the time complained that it was a voyeuristic autobiographical play, clearly based on his marriage with Marilyn, and it is clearly based on his marriage, and his subsequent relationship with Inga Marath. One critic called it at the time a 3.5-hour, quote, breach of taste, misogynistic, a shameless piece of tabloid gossip. So it doesn't go over very well. And that's sort of the last big play of his career. For the rest of his career, he continues to write plays, but they aren't received that well. They don't run that long on Broadway. And so he just sort of, as a playwright, begins to fade into the woodwork. But he still has a career. He becomes the president of an organization called PEN, which is a writers' organization where he fights for writers' rights to say what they want, freedom of speech. So he's still involved. He's still out there. He's giving speeches at political places. He is still a major cultural influence, even though his plays are not that significant. And we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the actors and directors that he worked with at the time. And the same thing sort of happens to them. They fade into the woodwork. He finally dies at the age of 89 in 2005 of bladder cancer and heart failure. But even that, he had one last controversy in his life with women. In 2004, he announces that he's fallen in love with a 34-year-old painter. But he dies a year later, and his daughter basically kicks the painter, the much younger painter, out of the house, and she isn't allowed to have anything from the will that he asked her to be given. So his life was a major success as a playwright, again, writing some of the most significant plays in American theater, both from a literary standpoint, from a political standpoint, The Crucible, from even, sort of a gossip standpoint. We're writing the play After the Fall. But the significant play of his career is Death of a Salesman. It opens on February 10th, 1949 at the Morosco Theater and runs for 742 performances, which is a pretty long run. The actors who start in it were major actors of their time on Broadway. But again, as I said earlier, their careers sort of fizzle out. Some of the names I think you might recognize. Lee J. Cobb played Willie Loman. He is a TV, film, Broadway star from the 30s to the 60s. He's in the film 12 Angry Men. He plays a boss in a Bond spoof film called In Like Flint. And he's in The Exorcist. Now at Halloween is an appropriate film to talk about. His Biff Loman is played by Arthur Kennedy, who also was a TV and film star from the 30s and 60s, and started off really hot. He was in Glass Menagerie. He was in the film Lawrence of Arabia. But then he goes to Fantastic Voyage, a cheap science fiction film from the 60s. He did all the big Broadway plays of the 40s. He was in The Crucible, All My Sons, Arthur Miller's play The Price. And so he was a very significant Broadway actor. Mildred Dunnick, who I don't remember hearing of, but she also was a TV and film star from the 30s to the 60s. She founded the Actors Studio, which was a very significant method acting school where Marilyn Monroe went to learn how to act. She was also in a really controversial film of the time called Baby Doll. She was with Elvis Presley in Love Me Tender, a film, and she was in Tennessee Williams' film Sweet Bird of Youth. She was also in a lot of the famous plays of the 30s and 40s. Cameron Mitchell played Happy Loman. Again, he was sort of significant from the 50s to the 80s, but ended his career with things like How to Marry a Millionaire, which had Marilyn Monroe in it, and was on TV in a Western series called High Chaparral. The play was directed by Elia Kazan, who, again, at this time was the most significant theater director and a significant film director. Also involved in the creation of the Actors Studio, also involved in method acting. Marlon Brando was one of the actors that he worked with a lot. He directed Marlon Brando in Streetcar Named Desire on Broadway and in the film. He directed the film On the Waterfront with Marlon Brando also in it. He also directed East of Eden with James Dean, who was another famous method actor of the time. But his career sort of ended with the McCarthy era. He did name names. And so Hollywood sort of turned against him because he had betrayed his friends that they were communists. It won award after award. It won the Tony Award the first year it was out for Best Play. It won the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. Arthur Kennedy won a Tony for Best Actor. It won Best Scenic Design. We'll see why that's important later on. Best Dramatic Producer, Best Author, Best Director. It just wipes up. It is so important. And it remains important after its original production. It is one of the most revived plays of Broadway history. So in 1963, the Guthrie Theater, which is 150 miles south of me in Minneapolis, its first season, the first play that they did was Death of a Salesman. The Guthrie Theater was a major theater that brought very high standards of theater to regional locations like Minneapolis. But it was also, in 1975, George C. Scott did a production of it at Circle in the Square. In 1984, Dustin Hoffman does a production at the Broadhurst Theater, which is then later turned into a film. In 1999, Brian Dennehy does a production, a revival at the Eugene ONeal Theater, and that is also turned into a film. And finally, in 2012, Philip Seymour Hoffman, directed by Mike Nichols, does a performance of the play. It, in addition to its runs on theaters in Broadway and across the country, there was a 1966 television version of it in which Lee J. Cobb and Mildred Dunnick reprised their roles from Broadway. And Gene Wilder, I don't know if you remember him, he was in Young Frankenstein, Charlie's Chocolate Factory. He played Bernard. It was done on stage in London, in India, in Germany, in China. In China, Arthur Miller directed the Chinese language version of it himself. There was a 1951 film with much of the original Broadway cast. Films have been done of it in the Soviet Union, Germany, and Sweden. So it is a major American theatrical event. But let's spend a little bit of time talking about the influences on Arthur Miller. American theater at the beginning of the time that Arthur Miller is beginning to work is really kind of bad. It's, if any of you have ever read Eugene ONeal's Long Day's Journey into Night, which I highly recommend, the character that is Eugene's father, Eugene ONeal's father, is a famous actor. He does a production of what is it? I can't remember. I'm sorry. He does a famous, it's a swashbuckling, the Count of Monte Cristo. It's a swashbuckling thing where he just, he does sword fights and it's very bravado, overacting. That's what American theater was like before Eugene ONeal, who we'll talk about a little bit later. And where do they get their influences? They're coming from Europe. There's two major playwrights there, Henrik Ibsen from Norway and August Strindberg from Sweden. Ibsen, you probably all know, is the founder of realistic drama, A Doll's House, Hedda Gabler, where the social problems of the era are presented on stage in a very realistic format. There are sets that look like the houses that people lived in at the time. Everything is very realistic. It's not swashbuckling anymore. They try not to overact. But even Ibsen, as he goes on in his career, he sort of becomes tired of realism. He realizes that it has limits. And so he begins to write what are often called symbolist plays. So they're still realistic. There's still a plot, but the characters will often stand for things. So, for example, he wrote a play called The Master Builder, which was about a famous architect, playwright, kind of similar. And so what he does is he tries to turn it into talking about the life of the artist, what happens in the artist, and he builds this parallel between the architect and the playwright. Arthur Miller recognizes this, and he even at one point writes an adaptation of one of Ibsen's later plays called Enemy of the People. August Strindberg from Sweden also does this kind of the same thing. He's a little bit later than Ibsen. He starts off with realistic dramas. Probably his biggest one is called The Father, which is about a man who is driven insane because his wife keeps taunting him that he might not be the father of his child. And so there's this sexual tension going on. And what happens is Strindberg very rapidly moves away from realistic theater and begins to write, again, what are normally called symbolist dramas. So, for example, there's one called A Dream Play, which is literally a dream with Freudian symbolism complete in it, that is presented on stage. He liked to do his plays. He would have a cloth that would go in front of you could see through it, but it was still a cloth that prevented you from seeing the detail of the play. And so it's a very interesting thing where he now begins to turn away from realism and doesn't even really want you to see the detail of what's on stage. And so now we have these two major influences that move from Scandinavia to America. And the first person that they influence the most is Eugene ONeal. Eugene ONeal, again, is this brilliant playwright who has this career that goes on for 40 years. The Hairy Ape is one of his first dramas. He writes about sea life. And there's these people that talk with heavy accents. The plays are written in the accent. And eventually he goes on. Again, my favorite play of his is something called Long Day's Journey into Night. It was actually published and produced after he had died because it was so autobiographical, and talked about his father and his drunken brother. And then Eugene ONeal now becomes this major influence on American drama. And Arthur Miller is one of the ones that begins to write that to follow the influence of ONeal. But there's also Tennessee Williams, Clifford Odets, Elmer Rice, Lillian Hillman, and Archibald MacLeish. And so in the 30s and 40s, you have this string of great plays that are being done on Broadway. And now on Broadway, you basically can only see revival. They don't do original drama anymore. They do original musicals, but they don't do original drama. And so it's just bizarre the way that there was this great period of drama being produced on Broadway. And again, talking a little bit about how ONeal went away from realistic drama. He wrote a play called Strange Interlude, which has, if you read it, what happens is in large font, there's the words that are spoken out loud. And then in small font, there's the words that the people are thinking. And it's really an interesting performance. I saw once Glenda Jackson did it on Broadway. And it was really interesting to see how they did that. O'Neill also liked Greek mythology. So he wrote another series of plays called Morning Becomes Electra, where Greek mythology, the Greek mythological characters of Electra, are transferred into the antebellum South. But the key here is that what Miller learns is there is this realism, that there is a plot to all of O'Neill's plays, but he is playing with the way the play is presented to the audience. Whether you have these, underscript under the thought words that are presented out loud, or just simply talking about mythological characters in the South. And so this is what we see Arthur Miller do in Death of a Salesman. Yes, it's a realistic play. There is a plot and a story that goes from beginning to end about Willy Loman. But he also now puts into the thing these relatively new, I don't think we can understand how original, how thought-provoking, how controversial this would have been at the time, that he does these flashbacks where suddenly you see that the stage does not show a realistic house. It shows an outline of a house. It never seems to work, but I'm going to show this. You can see that the original, you can't really see it that well. The original set was just the outlines of the house, and you have these apartment buildings in the background, as is described in the set directions. And people move between these flashbacks from the past. People walk through walls. They suddenly appear as children. It's kind of interesting because he even thought about using the original set for the play was going to be a brain, and it was going to be Willy Loman's brain. And the idea was that we were now inside Willy Loman's mind, seeing the story of his life. He obviously that would have been really out there. But still, we have to realize that the play with the non-realistic set is very different and unusual for the time. So now we've talked a little bit about the history of the play, where it fits into both European theater and American theater. So let's go. We're going to go even further back now, because when Death of a Salesman came out, there was a big debate, which Arthur Miller kind of started, trying to define whether Death of a Salesman was a tragedy. So let's go back. We're going to go back to Aristotle's Poetics. Aristotle, when he was writing the Poetics, he was trying to describe, if you've ever read any Aristotle, he's very outlining. Okay, a tragedy does this, A, B, C. A comedy does this, A, B, C. And so he tries to define what a tragedy is, and he takes as his example the Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. And so in book 6 of the Poetics, he defines a tragedy as an imitation of an action. Okay, it's an imitation. It's not real. It's not actually real. It's an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play in the form of action, not of narrative, through pity or fear, affecting the proper purgation of these emotions. So what he's saying is, okay, it's not really real. You've got a character who learns something, and that affects the audience. What Oedipus learns about his past affects the audience. There are also, Aristotle says, unities of time and place. And what he means by that is the time of the play takes place in a single day, and it confines itself. So he actually uses the word, it confines itself to a single revolution of the sun, and it takes place within one place. Oedipus is in Corinth, I think it is, in the downtown Corinth is where it takes place. And so this is what Aristotle says is a play. Now, through history, people go off and on of Aristotle's rules. Shakespeare's tragedies never have unities of time or place. They are completely different. You may have that purgation, you may have that development. You have the superior Hamlet is a prince. The main characters of the tragedies, the characters we are interested in Shakespeare's tragedies, are princes and kings. But page 50. But we've talked about them being kings and princes. Death of the Salesman is not about kings and princes. Linda, I'm sorry, my porch is being worked on if you hear noise in the background. Then make Charlie your father, Biff. You can't do that, can you? I don't say he's a great man. William Wellman never made a lot of money. His name was never in the paper. He's not the finest character that ever lived, but he's a human being, and a terrible thing is happening to him. So attention must be paid. He's not to be allowed to fall into his grave like an old dog. Attention must finally be paid to such a person. A small man can be just as exhausted as a great man. He worked for a company 36 years this March, opens up unheard of territories to their trademark, and now in his old age, they take his salary away. So William Wellman is not a tragic hero in the way that Aristotle says you should have a tragic hero, or even that Shakespeare says you should have a tragic hero. But again, there are elements of tragedy in the play. So two of the things that Aristotle says there should be, excuse my Greek pronunciation, peripeteia is a reversal of intention or situation, and an anagnorosis, which is a recognition scene. And Aristotle says they're best together. And the example is Oedipus. So in Oedipus, suddenly he realizes that he killed his father. He's been king for a decade, but suddenly he realizes that he has killed his father, who was the king of Corinth, and now he's married to his mother. And so there is this famous scene where suddenly Oedipus realizes this as he in the middle of this tragedy. And we sort of have the same thing in Death of a Salesman. He specifically uses the term kind of revelation when Biff steals the pen from the sales guys, the person who's going to save his life, his career. He steals the pen and he stops and he realizes, I was never a salesman for him. I only worked in the warehouse. So we have the same kind of realization, the same kind of peripeteia, where it's a reversal of fortune. He is at this point where he thinks he's going to save his career, he's going to turn it around, and then he suddenly realizes he never had a career to begin with. And so Miller spends a lot of time talking in the press. Can America produce a tragedy in the way that Aristotle wanted a tragedy, in the way that Shakespeare did a tragedy? And the answer is no, but it still counts as a tragedy because in America, it's the common man. We are driven by the common man. We don't need to be a king to have a tragedy in our life. So with that, I'm going to spend a little bit of time now talking about the American dream. And I'm going to use a discussion of the various characters in the play to talk about that American dream. But let's start off talking about an American dream. I think you can say that's what the Death of a Salesman is about. But one of the things I did at my last speech for Sullivan is I talked about what makes a play great, what makes Death of a Salesman great, is that there's not a single answer to any of the questions that Arthur Miller poses. He tells us that on the one hand, Willie Loman loves working in the outdoors. He likes to whistle, but on the other hand, he wants to be a salesman. And so there's no, you can't say in this play that A plus B equals C, that because of he gives you different interpretations of what's going on, and then asks you to think about what does the American dream mean to you? Can you live the American dream and still be a good part of society? The American dream plays a major part in American literature. So you can even argue that the Declaration of Independence, the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's the first definition of the American dream. But it goes on. Horace Greeley, a famous newspaperman in the 19th century, makes a comment to a young man, "Go west, young man," when he asks, "How should I succeed?" And Ben Greeley said, Horace Greeley says, "Go west, young man," meaning you have to go out into the new territory and make life for yourself. And this is, again, we sort of hear the same words from Willie's Uncle Ben. When I was 17, I walked into the jungle. When I was 21, I walked out, and by God, I was rich. He has made it, going into the wilderness by himself, working by himself. Ben Franklin, one of the fathers of the country, writes an autobiography in which he tells us a penny saved is a penny earned. Self-reliance, hard work are what what matters. If you're self-reliant and you work hard, you're going to succeed no matter what. He writes that he writes a, quote, bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection with a calendar that tracks his successes and failures. So he sets his goals. I've got 3 goals, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to succeed, which is like another famous American novel, The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. At the end of it, after Jay Gatsby has died, the main character, Nick Carraway, is talking to his father, to Jay Gatsby's father. And the father says, "You know what? He knew he was going to be good. Jay Gatsby knew he was going to be famous and great. He was going to be the Great Gatsby, because in his copy of Hop Along Cassidy, he wrote the following on the back cover. He was going to rise from bed at 6 a.m., do dumbbell exercise and wall scaling from 6:15 to 6:30, study electricity, etc., from 7:15 to 8:15, work from 8:30 to 4:30 p.m., baseball and sports from 4:30 to 5, practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it from 5 to 6, study needed invention from 7 to 9, no wasting time at Shafters or a name indesirable, no more smoking or chewing, bathe every day, read 1 improving book or magazine per week, save $5 crossed off, $3 per week, be better to parents. So just like Ben Franklin, Jay Gatsby had this formula for success. He knew what he needed to do to succeed. The American dream continues. Theodore Dreiser, the famous naturalist novelist, wrote a novel called American Dream. Edward Albee, a playwright from the 60s, 70s, 80s, writes a play called The American Dream. But you see the theme again and again in Toni Morrison, in John Steinbeck. The list goes on and on and on. But what we often find out is that the American dream is not necessarily a positive. It can be negative. Jay Gatsby becomes involved in a life of crime to become successful and famous. The comedian George Carlin says, it's called the American dream because you have to be asleep to believe it. And so you have to be asleep to believe it. So the Death of a Salesman, I think, counts as a negative presentation of the American dream. So now I'm going to go through the characters, and I'm going to try to decide which is the main character, which represents what we might want to think about the American dream. So we'll start off first with kind of a joke. Bernard, the sniveling little guy that's always running around, squealing on everybody else, telling them that, oh, he's stealing this stuff, he's failing at math, he's all the time whining, but he actually becomes, if you remember, the character who probably is the most successful. His father says, "How do you like that kid? Going to argue a case in front of the Supreme Court?" Pop, no, the Supreme Court. I got to run. Bye, Dad. Knock him dead, Bernard. The Supreme Court, and he didn't even mention it. He don't have to. He's going to do it. So he's kind of a success. Let's do our next character, Happy. Well, I don't think he really counts. He's kind of he's really sort of this sexual dynamo presented throughout, though. He's always picking up girls. Oh, I can smell it. Did you hear it, Stanley? I can smell it coming. He's kind of pathetic with his father. He's constantly dropping to the ground and doing bicycle wheels and saying, "Look, Dad, I'm losing weight." Like Peter with Christ, he even denies his father. When the two women come that he and Biff are going to go off with, he actually says, "No, that's not my father. That's just some old guy." So Happy doesn't feel like a good person to be the main character. Some critics say it's Linda. Linda is the cog that holds everything in the family together until she doesn't. She's self-reliant. She darns her stockings. She saves the pennies so she can save bills, doing what Ben Franklin says. She loves unconditionally. But critics that disagree sort of say, well, they think Linda's part of the problem. Maybe she should have used a little bit of tough love and sort of got on Willie instead of always accepting what Willie said. Get on him and say, "What are you doing?" And get on her son. In the end, she does sort of get on her sons about how they've treated their father. If anything, you can even say the female characters in Death of a Salesman are a little bit flat. It's the classic complaint of a male author writing female characters. The female characters are either Madonnas, Linda, the mother, or whores. What do we see? The woman in the bedroom who puts Willie through to the buyers in exchange for a pair of stockings and a good laugh. Miss Forsyth, who doesn't, quote unquote, happen to sell, but is a little bit too easily impressed with expensive champagne and claims of football stardom. So what about Willie? Obviously, he's the salesman of the play, of the Death of a Salesman. He's the salesman in the title. But we go back and forth with Willie. Willie goes back and forth about what he thinks. That's just what I mean. Bernard can get the best marks in school, you understand, but when he gets out in the business world, you understand, you are going to be 5 times ahead of him. That's why I thank God you're both built like Adonises, because the man who makes an appearance in the business world, the man who creates personal interest, is the man who gets ahead. Be liked and you will never want. You take me, for instance. I never have to wait in line to see a buyer. Willie Loman is here. That's all they have to know. And I go right through. But then, literally 4 pages later, he begins to complain to Linda. I'm fat. I'm very foolish to look at, Linda. I didn't tell you, but Christmas time, I happened to be calling on F.H. Stewart's, and a salesman I know, as I was going to see the buyer, I heard him say something about walrus. And I cracked him right across the face. I won't take that. I simply won't take that. But they do laugh at me. I know that. So we see both sides again and again of Willie, of wanting to be the success, of thinking that being a salesman is going to make him be a success. And yet he doesn't quite succeed at that. He wants to remember his father, the father who disappeared into the forest somewhere in the Midwest selling flutes. He looks to get advice from his uncle. But he hates and resents his next door neighbor, Charlie. There's 2 sides to Willie. A carpenter who can put up a ceiling and fix the porch steps, but also nobody does blame this man, Charlie says at the funeral. You don't understand. Willie was a salesman. And for a salesman, there is no rock bottom to life. He don't put a bolt to a nut. He don't tell you the law or give you medicine. He's a man out there in the blue, riding on a smile and a shoe shine. And when they start not smiling back, that's an earthquake. And then you get yourself a couple of spots in your hat and you're finished. Nobody does blame this man. A salesman has got to dream, boy. It comes with the territory. So you know, Charlie says he was a salesman. He did do what he said. But I think I'm still going to say that the main character that we care about, I think we care about Willie, we do. But the character that we care about and who changes, who has that realization that Aristotle talked about, is Biff. Biff is a lot like Willie. He wants to be a carpenter. He wants to be out, a cowboy out in the air. Everyone tells him that he should be successful. He was the football star. He's his dad and mom's favorite. But that privilege that he's earned along the way can be taken away. The American dream does not guarantee you success. He says it's because he whistles on the elevator, but really it's because he steals. His ineffective mother says that the jails are full of fearless characters, and Willie's brother snidely laughs, and the stock exchange. You can be a success and be a crook, or you can be a failure and be a crook. Biff is the only character who changes, who has an epiphany about what he is. No, nobody's hanging himself, Willie. I ran down 11 fights with a pen in my hand today, and suddenly I stopped. You hear me? And in the middle of the office building, do you hear this? I stopped in the middle of that building and I saw the sky. I saw the things that I love in this world, the work and the food and time to sit and smoke. And I looked at the pen and I said to myself, what the hell am I grabbing this for? Why am I trying to become what I don't want to be? What am I doing in an office, making a contemptuous, begging fool of myself when all I want is out there, waiting for me the minute I say, I know who I am? Why can't I say that, Willie? I am not a leader of men, Willie, and neither are you. You're never anything but a hardworking drummer who landed in the ash can like all the rest of them. I'm $1 an hour, Willie. I tried 7 states and couldn't raise it. $1 an hour. Do you gather my meaning? I'm not bringing home any prizes anymore, and you're going to stop waiting for me to bring them home. So he learns, he realizes that there is a fallacy in the American dream, that it does not guarantee all these things that the American dream tells you. You can guarantee yourself success. If you do, if you stick to your guns, if you save that penny a day, if you make that to-do list and get that to-do list done every day, you're going to succeed. Well, that's not true. The American dream, you have to be asleep to believe in it. And so with that, I come to the end of my notes about Death of a Salesman. And I'd like to open the floor to questions if anybody has any. Anybody there?
Participants, you can share the questions in the chat box.
Okay.
I request the participants to share the questions in the chat box.
Well, while we're waiting, thank you for the excellent session. While we're waiting, has anyone seen the play live before? It is a wonderful, some of those revivals I actually was able to see myself. And you know, it was great seeing Dustin Hoffman in it. You know, and
So here's the question: how does American Dream reflect? By Mr. S.
Well,
Gopinath.
I mean, I think I talked a little bit about that through the play. It is the you know, I said it the last time I did this, that I sort of succeeded in the American dream. I started off, my father was a mechanic. We didn't make much money. I was the first one in my family to go to college and go on to graduate school. And then had I like to think, successful career. And so that's sort of the American dream. That's what people want. But at the same time, not everyone can have the American dream. There's not enough to go around. And so, people who have done the same thing I did, he did it and did not succeed in going to college or whatever. So, I really think George Carlin's line, "You have to be asleep to believe it," is a great description of the American dream. But it is something that every American, and I always have said in my conversations with India, with the Indians that I worked with at HCL with Selvin, I think there's a lot the same thing for you guys too, that you work hard, you go to the university, and you're going to succeed. And many of the people I worked with at HCL, Selvin had succeeded at what he did, and so I think it's not just an American dream; it's an Indian dream too. I think. How do we make sense of Death of a Salesman in our daily life, apart from the American dream? Well, I think the realization that Biff has of trying to understand what it is that you want, that you don't have to do what other people say you have to do. I made the joke at the beginning of the presentation that I never quite fit in anywhere. I was not, I loved the arts, but I made my living at business, and business people didn't necessarily love the arts. And so, a lot of my interests, I did a film festival here in Duluth. I wrote for an arts paper where I interviewed Yoko Ono. I interviewed Yevtushenko, the Russian poet. And so, it's about what you want to do. How is Willie's death justified? Well, I mean, I think that's a hard question to answer. That he did. If $20,000 to pay off the house was good, that was good. But if he wanted the rest of his life to share with his sons and his wife clearly is crushed by the escape that he makes. So I don't think you can say that it's justified. How did we both sell something? Yeah. Yes, we did. We to a certain extent, a lot of people are involved in selling. I, again, with my writing for Xenia City Arts, I sold an image of myself as somebody that was interested in the arts and that could do these interviews. I once wrote an interview. I transformed it. It was about Shakespeare's Midnight Summer's Dream, and I transformed the interview into iambic pentameter. And so, again, I'm selling a certain vision of myself when I do that. Well, why did Willie Loman fail to be a successful salesman? Eventually, you run out of steam. That he got old. He remember he says at one point, I unload my sample case and I get out and I'm tired. In the old days, he could make 10 sales calls a day. Now that he's 64 or 63, he can't make as many sales calls as he used to make. His connections are gone. And so he was a successful salesman for a while. He wasn't as successful as he wanted to be, as he needed to be, but he could sell. But he ran out of energy. The world changed around him. You can't stay the same. Is the American dream a myth or reality? I wish I could answer that. I wish I could answer that. I mean, I think, to tell you the truth, I think it's becoming less of a reality. I think in the 40s and 50s and 60s, you know, I was able to go to college when my parents didn't. College is now outrageously expensive. And so I think the chance of going to college is not as easy as it used to be. Does the death of a salesman reflect the real life of Americans? In a lot of ways, yes. Yes, I think it does. Yeah, I think it does. That you could say that, you know, yes, I had a successful business career, but, you know, I left the company and, you know, I left a job that I'd worked at for 40 years, something like that. And so, you know, you could say that I was like Willie, leaving a job that I really was interested in and had done for a long time. And that was a big part of me. Well, the dysfunctional American family. So that's an interesting question. Are we going to call the Lohman family dysfunctional? In the beginning, they literally, the oldest son is a star football player. You know, he steals stuff. It's not great. And then the family sort of falls apart. It is something that comes that has become a greater part of film and drama and the novel, that we see more and more talk of that dysfunctional family. But again, Eugene ONeal, when you read Long Day's Journey into Night, his family was pretty dysfunctional, and he becomes one of the world's greatest playwrights. So it's hard, you know. I don't think he's a ghost. I think he's a memory. Remember I said that at one point Miller talked about that he was thinking of the set would be a brain. And so all of these things are memories, but remember, memory is not perfect. Memory, you change what you remember. So so I don't think it's a ghost, but he's a memory of Uncle Ben visiting him at a point in his career when he had to decide where he was going to go. Do I feel sympathy for Willie? I do. I think again, it's not his fault that he got old. We all get old. I'm getting old. And so you know, it's not his fault, and that he has to fight against a world that doesn't give him enough. Again, does the society really promise many things but offer nothing? I don't think it's that extreme. I mean, again, what I said in the course of the lecture, I think what's interesting about this play is that it doesn't give you a straight answer. Arthur Miller is not saying it's better to be a cowboy or out on the thing, because he ended up in jail at one point. He's not saying that being a salesman is bad. Remember that he gives that one speech about Mr. Singleman, the guy who sits in his room with his green slippers. So, you know, I don't think it's as simple as, you know, society bad, American dream bad. The death of a salesman tries to present a real life story, that you have two sides to this, and you have to decide which is the best way. Oh, Gatsby and Willie, I mean, I think that is just great. Gatsby has that same desire to succeed, and is willing to do anything to succeed. And so he gets involved with criminal elements, and all in the search, in the meantime, for this Daisy, for this woman of his life that he met 20 years ago and that he's still in love with. And so both, I mean, I call Great Gatsby the great American novel. My joke is I always say there's only one word in that novel that I would change. And the word, by the way, is dilatory. He describes a car coming up and up the driveway, and it's dilatory. I just think that's a little bit too wordy. But is the American dream a burden upon Americans? I wouldn't say it's a burden. It can be. I mean, it's a goal. It's something that is always in the back of your mind. I want to be rich. I want to be a famous playwright. I want to be this, I want to be an actor. I want to be a famous athlete. All those are there, but how many famous athletes are there? There's only a certain quantity of those. How many famous actors are there? How many famous playwrights are there? It's all limited. Does the death of a salesman present the difficulties life faced by a salesman in reality? Yes. I mean, think about it. He's on the road a bunch of his life. He's away from his kids. He's selling, silk stockings. But he has to be there. He has to be out there. Who represented American society best, Arthur Miller or Tennessee Williams? Good question. I tend to favor Arthur Miller. I don't know. I think he deals with bigger themes, and not necessarily that do I think that bigger themes are always better, but I tend to like Arthur Miller more than Tennessee Williams. But I like Tennessee Williams a lot too. So other playwrights that I mean, Eugene ONeal, you got to read him if you're interested in American drama. You got to read Eugene ONeal. A less well-known American playwright is somebody named Elmer Rice. I really like him. Again, he does this thing where he balances realistic theater with these sort of dream, fantastic play elements. So Arthur Miller, Tennessee Williams, Eugene ONeal, Elmer Rice. If you can get them, read them. Streetcar Named Desire. Can we relate? In a way, I mean, Streetcar Named Desire is the female character is the one, Blanche Dubois, is the one who has the dream, Marlon Brando doesn't have a dream, he's happy with Stella and he's happy with his life. And he's happy drinking with his buddies, playing cards. But Blanche does have a dream outside the ordinary. She wants to be more than she is, and yet doesn't succeed. Where Willie plants seeds. If anything, what is the significance of the scene where Willie plants seeds? It's interesting that it's right before he commits suicide that he does this. It is his. And remember, he says it that there's no sunlight in the backyard anymore. It's an impossibility. He's not going to grow a garden, and so he's going to make one last futile effort to grow that garden, to plant that garden, and it's not going to work. And he's going to commit suicide. So. Well, I really appreciate all of these questions, and I can't believe how many people showed up for this. It's amazing. I really enjoyed my time, and I hope that you found my presentation good. And Selvin, thank you once again for inviting me to your students. All right, so I think I'll hang up, Selvin. Is that okay?
Thank you so much, sir. It was a wonderful session. We enjoyed a lot, and it was indeed nice meeting you. I should thank
Nice to meet you.